Welcome everybody to this event. You know, it's very exciting for us because we're only just getting back into public meetings again, so it does seem rather strange, but we really appreciate how you have come out to attend this meeting. I'm welcoming you on behalf of ICAD UK, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, UK, Jewish Network for Palestine, and members of the One Democratic State campaign. The title of this evening is One State in Palestine, Back to the PLO Solution. Our distinguished guests are going to present their views on one democratic state, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. One country, one citizenship, one parliament, and one shared civil society in which cultural, ethnic, and religious identities of all the country's people groups find expression. What would such a state look like? And is it possible to actually decolonize Israel? Each of our speakers will address this topic, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. Now, I have to say that 90 minutes is far too short to really unpack this topic at any length, but we'll do our best to give you an overview of it. I said, answer some of your questions, and then look forward to more events happening in the future as we continue to address this possibility. I would like to call upon our first speaker, who is Jeff Halper. Jeff Halper is an American by birth who has lived in Jerusalem since moving there to do his doctorate. He's an Israeli anthropologist who has taught in universities in Israel, the States, and in Central America. He serves as the director of ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's based in Jerusalem, and he's a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. He's the author of several books. I'll just point out a couple of them now. One is War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification, which was shortlisted for the Palestine Book Award. His latest book is Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Settler Colonialism, Zionism, and the Case for One Democratic State. Jeff participated in the first and successful attempt of the Free Gaza movement to break the Israeli siege into Gaza. And he was nominated by the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, for the Nobel Peace Prize, along with Palestinian intellectual and activist Ghassan Andoni. So, with no further ado, Jeff, please come and speak to us. Thank you. Jeff Halper.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Rada and to Chaim for agreeing to participate as well. I think all of us have been involved with the whole issue of a one-state approach to resolving, what's happening in historic Palestine. I mean, I'm actually a newer convert to that, having had other analyses over the years. I mean, my analyses have changed as my knowledge has grown and the situation has changed as well. But it all derives from the fact, ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, has always been a political organization. We're now marking our 25th year as an organization, unfortunately. I wish we could declare tonight that there's no longer need for an Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. But we've always been political. And the focus has always been, for us, on how to resolve this whole issue. In other words, we are activists, we do resist, we do write, we do organize campaigns, we do rebuild homes, we do a lot of the things. And you all do a lot of things, from BDS to organized campaigning, to organizational work, to lobbying, and all that is really important. But you can't be in a political struggle without a political program, without an end game. I mean, what are you BDSing for? Everything we're doing towards what end? And there's a danger, actually, if everything is frozen and there's no political program, that much of what we're doing actually contributes to the illusion that somehow we're resisting and somehow things are being done, even though in fact nothing is moving whatsoever. And that can be a dangerous illusion. Gives us a feeling that we're getting somewhere where in fact we're really stuck. So, as you know, there really hasn't been a political program for 30 years or so. As Linda indicated in her introduction, the Palestinians got it in the very beginning. From the beginning of the 20th century, from the very start of Zionism, the Palestinians understood that they were being invaded by a colonial force. That Zionism was a settler colonial movement. They might not have had that terminology, which is kind of new in the academic world, but they knew it and they wrote about it in their newspapers and they organized against it. Even in the early 1900s, almost as soon as the Zionists began to appear, it became clear what they were after, and they made clear exactly what they were after. They were after taking over the country and Judaizing it. That anti-colonial resistance lasted all the way through the Mandate period. Of course, with a certain hiatus, I guess, not in terms of the concept that the Palestinians are in an anti-colonial struggle, but from the ability to actually organize and work from, let's say, 1948 until the PLO was established in the middle of the 1960s. So there was a hiatus. But when the PLO was, especially after the 1967 war, when Arafat and the Palestinians really took over the PLO, from the very beginning, they returned to the idea that this is an anti-colonial struggle. The PLO's position was always that we're fighting for liberation, we're in an anti-colonial struggle against Zionism. It was only, of course, as we know, into the 1970s and culminating in 1988, that the Palestinians, I'm not going to get into why, I was in that room, but where the PLO began to shift from a liberation struggle, an anti-colonial organization, into one that accepted the idea that they're in a conflict with Israel. And that led them, of course, in 1988 to formally adopt the two-state solution as the political program that then led into Oslo, which, from my point of view at least, was a fatal mistake. And I think Palestinians are aware of that. And we're all paying the price for that today. But since, I'm going to argue in a second that the two-state solution isn't dead. The two-state solution was never alive. It was never a concept. It was never an intent. But certainly, even if people do still think in terms of conflict and two sides and a two-state solution, certainly since the end of the Oslo peace process in 2000, roughly, in other words, more than 20 years ago, certainly we all understand, and I think the Palestinians understand, that the two-state solution never was, and it's gone, and it's not a political program. But there is no alternative political program that's emerged over the years. For the last 20 years, there's been a vacuum. And again, all the resistance and protest and campaigning and resistance of Palestinians on the ground and work we do as Israelis that are trying to fight Israeli colonization and occupation is all important. But if you don't have an end game, if you don't have a political program, you're not a political actor. You're not a political actor. And so about 5 years ago in 2017, a good number of Palestinian activists, intellectuals, academics, political figures. The head of the One Democratic State campaign is Awad Abdel Fattah, who was one of the founders with Azmi Bishara of the Balad Party, or the Tijamo Party in Israel, the Palestinian Nationalist Party, and was for many years the Secretary General. And there are some very prominent Palestinians involved, both within 48, in the occupied territories, and also in the diaspora. But we came together, Palestinians and anti-colonial, or I could even say anti-Zionist Israelis like myself, we came together, and over a couple of years, we managed to formulate a 10-point political program. In other words, the idea of one state, of course, has floated around for a long time. And there's been conferences and there's been declarations. And Rada and Chaim are involved with another one democratic state group that we're in contact with. They'll talk about that as well. And I think our collective attempts have been to really make this concept of one state concrete. Give it detail, give it substance, so it really becomes a political program. What the one democratic state group did, the ODS group did, for example, is they drafted a constitution for that state. What we've done is we've tried to think through the entire process of how do you decolonize Zionism and the colonial state of Israel, and then what do you replace it with? I mean, decolonization, liberation are one stage, but then what do you replace it with? And to try to visualize, and that's the thing I want to talk about briefly tonight, what one democratic state would look like, how it would work, and why it would be just and doable. So I want to suggest two things tonight, really quickly. One is that in order to go anywhere, to go forward politically, whether in understanding what this issue is about or in formulating a political program that's meaningful, we have to undergo a paradigm shift. And it's not just semantics. We talk about this as a conflict. You know, we all talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. We talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Governments talk about it. The media talks about it. Even Palestinians refer to it as a conflict. And there isn't another term that's usually used. I mean, it's known as a conflict. And that's been the conception that has guided, if you want to put it that way, the political process, over the last, certainly ever since 1967, if not before. But it's not a conflict. And it's a very important distinction. A conflict takes place between two or more sides. Okay, the minute you say sides, and Israel is one of those sides, you're legitimizing Israel as a side. From our point of view, you're legitimizing a settler colonial movement as a legitimate side in a conflict. So right there, you begin to get the language we know so well. Both sides. Both sides should end the conflict, both sides should end the violence, both sides should negotiate, right? And it becomes a false symmetry between a unilateral invasion of a colonial people into a foreign country and the resistance of the indigenous population to that invasion. So conflict creates that false symmetry that certainly benefits and legitimizes the colonial side. It actually decolonizes, in some ways, the colonial side because it becomes simply a side. Of course, a conflict has to do with a dispute. You're in conflict over something. So there's a dispute. But in this situation, there is no dispute. Well, what's the dispute? Palestinians never got into a dispute with the Zionists. They were living in their country. And towards the turn of the 20th century, were invaded by the Zionist movement, which is super well documented. And so there's no dispute here. There's resistance. And of course, if there's a dispute, how do you resolve disputes? How do you resolve a conflict? Conflict resolution. What does that mean? It means both sides sit down, they negotiate, right? They compromise. And they come up with some kind of a deal of the century, right? Well, if you're a colonized people, what are you going to negotiate? What are you negotiating? Your national existence, your physical existence, your heritage, your ties to your own country, the fact that you're being dispossessed. I mean, what is there exactly to negotiate in this kind of a situation? And what is there to compromise on? So the whole idea of a conflict locks us into a way of thinking, a way of approaching, and I'll get to that in 1 second, that completely misanalyzes the situation and is a trap for us. That we have to, and so we need an alternative term. There isn't a real convenient, short, readily understandable alternative term. Everybody gets what a conflict is. Everybody gets what occupation is. Everybody gets what apartheid is. Settler colonialism? Whoa, that sounds like it belongs in SOAS somewhere, in some lecture hall, in some textbook. I mean, that's way too complex and not a vague concept. But that's the name, and we have to see how we can improve on that. But what I'm trying to suggest is the paradigm shift we have to go through, which means a whole new language. And it leads us in a completely different direction politically. It has an alternative logic. These aren't just two alternatives. They have absolutely alternative logics to them. We have to stop using the word conflict, the concept conflict, and we have to consider this, the Palestinian struggle, as an anti-colonial struggle against Zionist settler colonialism. I mean, that I think names the issue. And it's a struggle of the Palestinian people together with anti-Zionist or anti-colonial Israelis against Zionist settler colonialism. So, and again, this isn't just semantics, because it locks us into different, if you're a doctor and you're diagnosing some disease, the treatment that you give flows from your diagnosis. Well, if you're misdiagnosing, if you're using a wrong term and a wrong set of principles and a wrong understanding, you're going to get to a political conclusion. In other words, you don't get to one democratic state through the idea of conflict. It doesn't lead to that. That's not a compromise. And at the same time, you don't get to a two-state solution if you conceive of this as a settler colonial issue and not a conflict. So, in other words, if it's a conflict, the two-state solution is very understandable, because that's the compromise. You have both sides, right? They're compromising, and the result, just or not, it doesn't matter. Conflict resolution is whatever you can get both sides to sign on. So it usually has nothing to do with justice or anything like that. You get to a two-state solution that doesn't work, and we know it. And in fact, it hasn't worked. And in fact, it never was, because Zionist settler colonialism always, from the very beginning, aspired to Judaize, which is the word they use and still use, to Judaize Palestine. The whole purpose of Zionism, until today, was to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, transform Palestine into the land of Israel. Well, if you get that's the settler colonial agenda, that's not going to lead you to a two-state solution. And in fact, because we understand that, I think, today much more, we can say that the two-state solution isn't only gone, but it never was at all. We've wasted all these years trying to negotiate something that was unjust and undoable and completely not in the cards. On the other hand, if you approach this from a settler colonial point of view, you get to a whole different place politically. Apartheid, that now, at least Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the UN, many other human rights organizations have really documented exhaustively why this is an apartheid system. You wouldn't get to apartheid from a conflict point of view. But apartheid is the natural outcome of a settler colonial movement, because if in fact the settlers want to take over the whole country, if you want to Judaize Palestine and take the land and make it into a Jewish state and a Jewish country and displace and dispossess the Palestinians, okay? But like in South Africa, you're not able to dislodge all the Palestinians. We managed to expel half of them, but there's still 6 million Palestinians that remain. Well, how do you make the country Jewish and half the population or more is Palestinian? So the only way out of that dilemma is apartheid, where Israel today rules over 85% of the country, and the Palestinians, 4/5 of whom have no citizenship, are locked into 15% of the country, which is a very similar proportion to South Africa. Well, that is Israel's solution. Israel believes that it can support apartheid in the way that it can sustain apartheid in the way that South Africa couldn't. And in fact, the international support that Israel gets, including, of course, from your governments, give Israel reason to believe that that's the case. But the only other alternative, it's almost mathematical. If it's not a conflict, it's not a two-state solution. Apartheid is possible. It's done, actually, but it's not acceptable. And so the only alternative becomes one democratic state. In other words, one democratic state does two things in particular. One, it decolonizes. In other words, the only way you end a colonial situation is to decolonize it. You don't end the colonial situation through negotiations. You have to decolonize the colonials. Otherwise, you're leaving the power structures and the power differentials in place, even though it appears that maybe you've negotiated something like a two-state solution. And in fact, and I won't get into this, it's in my book, Israel has imposed what I call a dominance and maintenance regime. In other words, there's a real strategy, and our group has tried to deal with that, of how do you exactly decolonize? What does it mean to decolonize Zionism? Which I'm not going to get into now. A second part of the liberation process for Palestinians is that the Palestinians have to sit down among themselves and say, what does liberation mean to us? What are the minimal requirements? What do we need to bring our people together, to bring our people back home, to heal our people, to unite our people, to give our people a future, to really have a national life that's meaningful and substantial? What does that mean for us? And to come to that without dealing with Israelis, that's an intra-Palestinian discussion. And the third part of the liberation process is then the Palestinians have to take their concept of liberation, and now you've got the problem, all right, how do you reconcile that with the fact that after decolonization, half the population of your country is still going to be Israeli Jews? It's not going to be Israel, but Israeli Jews are not leaving. I mean, they're a fact of life. So how then do we reconcile those two things? And I just have a minute left, but let me just say there's four, really quick, it's a 10-point program, but there's four main aspects to our program. First one is, one democratic state means that one state equals citizenship for all its inhabitants. In other words, one person, one vote, one government, one parliament, one legal system, one constitution, with no ifs, ands, or buts. No confederation, no federation, no binational state, an absolute straightforward democracy. And that by itself begins to dismantle a lot of the colonial system. Because as we know, the colonial system of Israel is based on the hierarchy. Who you are in terms of your national and religious identity determines where you are in society and what's open to you in society. Equal citizenship breaks that down. Secondly, the right of the return of the refugees. Of course, I mean, that has to be a priority. The refugees. Now, what's interesting, we get into the logic of a civil state, one democratic state. The refugees have a double right to return. And that is, they have a right to return in international law. But they're also the citizens of that country. Just because in 1948, you fled your home during a war or you were driven out of your home. Doesn't mean you lost your civil status. This whole concept of ours of refugees as being rightless, stateless people is simply not true, especially in a democratic state concept. They have never lost their citizenship. And so they simply come back. In other words, they have the right to return, but they also come home automatically as citizens. I won't, and there's more to say that I won't. The third aspect is what I talked about before, which is really crucial. And I don't know how to say it in a sentence, but I'll try. And that is that, you have one state of equal citizenship. But we all know that Palestine is not Nebraska. And it's not just a bunch of individual citizens running around. There are national groups. And I think we all have to accept the fact that there are two national groups. I mean, there are two national groups in Palestine. There's Palestinian Arabs and there are Israeli Jews. And the problem with national groups, and then there's Hamas and there's religious, there's a third aspect, which is more of a religious nationalism than kind of a nationalism. And the problem, of course, with national groups and religious groups is that they want to be hegemonious. They want to take over. If you think of what does Palestinian liberation mean, it means us Palestinians come back and take our country back. We liberate it. We liberate ourselves, and so that the assumption is that this will become a Palestinian state again. But then you hit up again against the problem of, what happens to the Israelis? And it goes the other way as well, because of course Israelis don't recognize Palestinian Arabs as, so that what's happened in the global South is that after the colonial powers have been defeated and independence and liberation have been achieved, the vast majority of post-colonial states fall back into civil war. And what is crucial then in this, and this is what I just want to say, what's crucial here is that there's a civil state, that we have to create a neutral civil state. We don't have a name for it. Let's call it Zatarville, the state of Zatar, whatever, in which you have a shared civil identity. You have like a third realm of sovereignty. And that civil state is sovereign. And it's sovereign over the national groups. So you create space for the national groups. You can't ignore them. They're there and they're powerful and they need their space. And people need the space. Refugees coming back are coming back as Palestinians. The importance here is not only to provide a third space, but it has to be a space, a civil space strong enough that it can contain and control the impulses of national and religious groups to want to take control. You see, the only way it's going to work is if you have a civil state that keeps everything in control and that's shared by everyone. And then the fourth element is that if you have a strong civil society emerging, that then can give rise to a new civil identity, to a new civil society, a new political community. Especially, I think, in the beginning, young people, middle-class people, more secular people will understand that. And over time, this civil society will grow and strengthen so that you really create a third shared space for Israelis and Palestinians. I ran over time, and I'm sorry. It's a lot to present, but at any rate, this is I think you're getting the idea. This is a framework of a genuine political program that I think is just and doable and comes out of the whole idea that you have to decolonize Zionism. How it can be done is something we can talk about maybe in the questions and answers.
Now you know why I said we need a lot of time to really unpack all of this, but it's good taster for us right now. Our next speaker is Haim Rashid. Professor Haim Rashid grew up in Israel. He's a filmmaker, photographer, and film studies scholar. He worked at the University of East London, where he gained his professorship. And he was a professorial research associate here at SOAS. He has worked as the editor of The Gulf War and The New World Order with Mira Yuval Davis. and he's the author of Holocaust for Beginners with Stuart Hood. His films include the widely shown State of Danger, a documentary on the first Palestinian Intifada, and London is Burning after the 2011 riots. He has also written in the Israeli Haaretz and the Cairo-based Al-Aram Weekly. Haim Rashid is also a member of the Jewish Network for Palestine, BRCA, British Committee for the Universities of Palestine, the One Democratic State Campaign, and the Convencia Alliance, including Jews, Muslims, and Christian groups. Haim, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming today, and thank you, Linda, for inviting me to join my two good friends. We have spoken many times together before, and I hope we shall do so again. Last night, Jeff and myself had an unpleasant experience. Linda has organized, as head of ICAD UK, a meeting because of Jeff's coming to London. We wanted to use this opportunity to speak to Jewish groups who support Palestine and about the one democratic state. We both spoke, and I can just say that we were not welcome. I'm using a very neutered term. Basically, people said to us, why are you telling us this? We don't need to know about it. It's not interesting, it's nothing to do with us. And we have more important things to do, like to do solidarity with Palestine. So I want to answer that question just in case it might come later on. Why did we speak to Jewish solidarity organizations in London? Because I'm now standing and you are sitting a few miles away from where the Balfour Declaration was signed. Actually, SOAS played a minor role in that, and I've written about it in the SOAS magazine. Because SOAS was created the year before as the farm for training colonial administrators. And they advised on the Balfour Declaration, and another man who advised about the Balfour Declaration, not surprisingly, was the first and legendary editor of The Guardian. So this is why we're speaking about it to people in London, because London has created the Palestine problem. If not for the Balfour Declaration and everything that followed, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Palestine, because the Palestinian would still be there. So that's the first thing I wanted to remind people, that we, the British, have a duty which nobody else has, because we have created this problem, the Irish problem, the India-Pakistan problem, the Cyprus problem, and I won't go on. It's about time that the British stopped pretending that they are an empire and start mending the crimes of that empire for 200 or 400 years, if you think about Ireland. Now, I want to ask a few questions because I want to stick to time. Peter Beinart published yesterday a very interesting article in which he starts discussing the Palestine problem by answering, not very well, I must say. I really appreciate Peter Beinart's work, but I don't think his answer is very good to the question, does Israel have a right to exist? And he twists and turns, because you can't say, like Jeff has just told us, Israel does not have a right to exist because it's a settler colonial project, for fuck's sake. You know, you have to remember what it is. Israel has no more right to exist than the Raj of India under the British, yeah? Or the control of Cyprus under the British. Now, of course, there are great differences. I won't go into them now, but that's one of the questions that people are asking you. Are you actually saying that Israel has no right to exist? Yes, we're saying Israel, as it is set up, has no right to exist, never had a right to exist. We're not saying that Jews can't live in Palestine, and the Palestinians are not saying that, which is more important than what we are saying. So, if Israel is a militarized colonial project, which makes the life of every Palestinian hell before they are shot and killed in the street or in the home or in their bed, why would we have an argument about its right to exist? The second thing to do is to say no Jew has come up with a plan as progressive as the PLO plan of 1964 of one democratic state in Palestine. Different groups, and I don't have time to talk about it, and the leading one is Brit Shalom, in the 30s until 1933, have done a lot of work about the binational state. But I think, having listened to Jeff, you know that we're not talking about a binational state, because a binational state means a Zionist state in part. And a Zionist state cannot be part, and Zionism and colonialism cannot be part of the solution. It is the problem after all, so it cannot be part of the solution. So different Jewish and then Israeli intellectuals went as far as a binational state because they were unable or unwilling or both to give up on this idea of a nationalism of colonialists that will continue. Imagine South Africa that has a party, the colonial party, okay? And they want to chuck the blacks back to where they were during apartheid. This is the kind of binational state we're talking about, yeah? This is the argument of Zionism. Palestinians shouldn't be there. Now, what we are talking about, and let's be brutally clear about this, because a lot of Jews in Britain especially, I think this is not the case in the United States. People are much more intelligent about this now, especially young people. Naturally, they are more intelligent than us. And they know that we're talking about a decolonized space. And that's what we need to start doing. And if we are not talking about decolonizations, I don't have to talk to people that don't talk about that, because as you just heard, there is nothing to dispute and to discuss. The only subject that Israeli Jews need to now think about is how to decolonize the system that they have built over almost 80 years that have caused untold suffering to the Palestinians. And we have no right, neither Jeff, nor myself, nor many of you who may be Jewish or Israeli, we have no right to live in Palestine unless the Palestinians agree to this. If you don't accept that, you are supporting colonialism. And I'm sure there are not many supporters of colonialism here. The last thing I want to start on is the meme of the two-state solution, the narrative of the two-state solution, is what is on the lips of every idiot in parliament. Every time that you talk about Palestine, you hear, I support a two-state solution. Most of the friends of Israel in parliament are also friends of Palestine. Of course, if you are believing, I think Jeff has shown this very clearly, if you are believing there is a conflict, then be friends of both sides of the conflict and you will be able to work things out. How can you be a member of Friends of Israel, an organization that plans and executes the removal of ministers from the British government, successfully may I say, and also be a member of Friends for Palestine that are actually suffering because of the British mandate and everything that followed? Most of the members of the House do not recognize the responsibility of Britain for what we're facing. So first of all, I think we need to kill that meme. We need to kill that idiotic meme of I support the two-state solution. Now, how do you do it? If you don't suggest a solution which is realistic, which is just, which is doable, which is practical, which people can understand because they read about Ireland and they read about South Africa, and they know that these things are possible. And they also know that Jews and Muslims lived for over 1,000 years in great friendship and convivencia. And anti-Semitism was never a problem in the Arab world, apart from, two cases that everyone knows about in 1942 in Iraq. This is nonsensical. Anti-Semitism is a Christian European invention in the same way that slavery was a Christian European invention. In the same way that capitalism is a Christian European invention. So that there was not in history a problem for Jews to live in Al-Andalus, There was not a problem for them to live in the Ottoman Empire. There was not a problem for them to live in the Safavid Empire. There was not a problem for them to live in the Mughal Empire because they were controlled by non-Christians, in other words, by Muslims. And those Muslims invited the Jews of Al-Andalus in 1492 to come to Istanbul and live there and thrive there and be at the top rungs of the, as they were in Al-Andalus during the convivencia period. So, there is only one state between the river and the sea. Now, and for many years before. Since 1967, there is only one state between the river and the sea, but that is a sick and sickening apartheid state. And every day, this label is more justified than the day before. And every day, the life of Palestinians are more fraught and dangerous and miserable than before. So, if there is one state, what do we want? What are we telling our politicians we want? Remember that without, the combined age of the panel is 200 years or something. I am looking forward to a panel that actually come over 100. Pretty soon we will have young people talking about it. This is why we're talking about it, to bring young people to the topic. But those of us that remember what has happened in those 80 years of Zionism, because we lived through it, know that there has never been anything but this state of apartheid, even before 1967, between the river and the sea. So South Africa will never have been resolved unless millions of people, hundreds of millions of people went to the government and said, one man, one vote, or that's what they said. They meant one person, one vote, yeah? But you know what it is. So they wanted a democracy that included everyone. And they got a kind of democracy. And our groups, our different groups in their deliberations about, and that's why we wrote the Constitution for Palestine as a united country, we wanted to discuss those details so that we don't add with a second-rate solution. Read Naomi Klein about, she is amazing, describing the machinations of the Americans in South Africa in the early 90s. So we don't want that. We want exactly what Jeff has described. One secular democratic state in which everyone can live in equality, in which the refugees are welcome and helped, in which the decades of terrible suffering of the Palestinians are addressed in many ways, not just a truce and reconciliation commission, which is a symbolic act, but in all the aspects that need to be addressed. And to end, people say to you, you are idealist, you are impractical, this can never happen. Well, it happens. It happens if people push hard. It happened in South Africa. It happened in Northern Ireland. No one is killed every day or every week in Northern Ireland like they used to. It's not ideal, we know, but there isn't even a government there yet because of the Tories and the Unionists. But we don't have the conflict in Northern Ireland. It was being decolonized to a degree. So anyone that tells you that this is not possible is trying to make it impossible. Now, what is possible, according to the Zionists? Apartheid, we heard. That is possible, it's working for them, and they want to continue it. If you disagree with that, what is possible? And we're saying to you, this is possible with your support, with everyone's support, like happened in the case of South Africa. So, unless we have something to put before our lawmakers, our politicians, our diplomats, the UN, the different bodies, we are not in the game. We are just doing, okay, you suffer, and we will build classes, we will build water developments in the West Bank or in Gaza, we will build rooms in universities. So the Israelis will bomb them, they will steal them, they will continue to uproot everything that Europe and the United States are paying for. And Europe and the United States, when they build a classroom, when they build a farm, with environmental provision know that it might take a year or not even that, and this will be gone. So we don't want that. We don't want to ease the suffering of the Palestinians. We don't want merely to be solidaire with them. We do need that. I said not merely. We want political action to support us in Israel, Palestine, coming together. And the last question is, what shall we call it? I don't know, but I thought last night that we'll call it Pi, P-I, and we can, then you say, you can call it Pie in the Sky, you know? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chaim. And now our next speaker, Ghada Karmi. Ghada Karmi was born in Jerusalem, but was forced to leave with her family as a result of Israel's creation in 1948. The family then moved on to England in 1949, where she grew up and was educated. She practiced as a doctor for many years, working as a specialist in the health of migrants and refugees. She held a number of research appointments on Middle Eastern politics and culture here at SOAS and in universities in Durham and Leeds. From 1999 to 2001, Ghada Karmi was an associate fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, where she led a major project on Israel-Palestinian reconciliation. In 2009, she became a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Currently, Ghada Karmi is a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, University of Exeter. And she's the author of several books, including In Search of Fatima, an account of her childhood in Palestine and coming of age in London, Married to Another Man, her call for Palestinians and Israelis to live together in one democratic state, and her latest, Return, a Palestinian memoir. Ghada Karmi, please come to the microphone. You've got the look, you take it.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to see you all. The one democratic state is a wonderful vision because not only was it the idea, visionary idea of the PLO by a people who had already been traduced, expelled and tormented by the colonial settlers, for them to come forward themselves and offer this wonderful hand to the usurpers who'd done them so much harm, and to say, look, let's sort this out, let's try and live together in what was called a democratic, non-sectarian state. That was really visionary. I've talked about it, I've believed in it, the one democratic state, for as long as I can remember. But now, having said that, there is a reality I cannot ignore. If you ask Israeli Jews, a majority of Israeli Jews, do they think it solves the issue, solves the problem, the one democratic state shared with Palestinians? They will say, certainly not. A majority will say, we don't want to live with these people, because you know as well as I do that a majority of Jewish Israelis regard the Arabs, as they call them, as in a racist way. They consider them, in some cases, subhuman. Certainly the people in Gaza are subhuman. They are terrorists and people to be scared of. This is a reality. Now, if you ask people who believe this and think this, how do you feel about living with these people in one equal society? They will say, no, thank you. No, thank you. Well, then what do you want to see, you ask them. They say, somehow, magically, we want them to disappear. We don't want Arabs here. We don't want them around. And in fact, what's happened is the next best thing, which is that the Israeli state has tried to minimize the Palestinian presence, not only through a continuing ethnic cleansing program, but through dismissing, belittling, dehumanizing Palestinians in such a way that you can ignore them. And you know very well that, physically speaking, Palestinian communities under Israeli rule are separated physically from Jewish Israelis. That's certainly true of the West Bank, it's true in Gaza, with the very serious consequences of what that does. Add to it a factor which is extremely important, which we cannot afford to ignore, which is the complicity of Western states, the power given to Israel by Western states, the power given to it and the approval given to it as it is, not as, well, you could be a democracy, why don't you? As it is, apartheid, brutal, oppressive. As it is, it enjoys Western support. This is very important. Now, if we look at the Palestinian Arabs and you ask them what they think about Jewish Israelis, a lot of them, most of them, nearly all of them will tell you, these people are usurpers, they are aggressors, and they are aliens. They are alien settlers who've come from other lands, other countries whose cultures we don't understand, and it's nothing to do with us. That attitude has been enhanced by the physical separation I just mentioned. So, I can tell you many people in towns and cities in the West Bank have never seen Israelis except as soldiers. And this is very important. And in Gaza, because of the siege, increasingly Palestinians in Gaza don't meet Israelis. They don't see them except when bombs are being thrown on them from the skies. For them, the idea of a Palestinian state, now my colleagues talked about the two-state solution, but you know the component of the two-state solution, which has been very attractive for Palestinians, is the idea of an independent Palestinian state. The fact that it is in a tiny corner of Palestine, as projected by the two-state solution, is something they'll even put up with in return for a sense of independence, not to be with Israeli military breathing down their necks, and to have their own flag, to have the freedom not to mix with these soldiers. Many Palestinians fear that in what we're talking about as a democratic shared state, they genuinely fear that the more advanced Jewish citizens of that state will make them into second-class citizens. They can't keep up. Add to that it's the end of resistance for a lot of Palestinians. The Palestinians have resisted so bravely. So many of them have died. What about these martyrs? Do you just say, never mind about that, let's all go and live with these people who are killed? And look at Hamas. Hamas exists, and Islamic Jihad exists. They have a particular vision. And they certainly, if you said to them, well, how about forgetting about that vision and let's all come and live together, they won't do it. Because remember, I've just said, if you asked the majority of Jewish Israelis, what would you like to see? They'd say to you, for the Arabs to disappear. Now, if you ask the majority of Palestinian Arabs, what would you like to see? They will tell you, we'd like the clock back, put back to before 1948, when these people were never here, and this country was ours, and it was Palestine, and there was no doubt about it. Given that level of rejection by both sides, which is real, if you had time and education and people were getting used to the idea, you could, in theory, arrive at a point where a majority of people will be persuaded that actually sharing the land in a democracy is the only realistic way out of this. You could imagine that happening. But I think it would take a very, very long time. And I'm not in any way belittling the efforts of the One Democratic State campaign. There is a way that you can crack this. There is only one ruling sovereign state between the river and the sea. This is clear. This is a fact. The people of that state are ruled by the State of Israel. So there are no partitions, there are no two states, there's none of that. There is one state, and it's ruled by Israel. The population of that state is roughly equal, half and half, roughly, between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. Now, the apartheid that Israel practices, which is the way it's trying to deal with this, itself is insupportable. It cannot continue. People eventually react against apartheid, as we know very well from South Africa. So the Palestinian position would be to say to the State of Israel and to the world, we are being governed by the State of Israel. Half of us have rights and citizenship. Half of us have no rights and no citizenship. We can't have that. Either Israel leaves our territories, or if it wants to stay, and we can't do anything about that, we're not strong enough, we demand equal rights. With all the people that Israel currently rules, we demand equal rights. Now, I want to put it to you that if this is done properly, by that I mean it's done as a collective aim, not just inside Palestine, Israel, but outside as well, in the diaspora, people like me and some other people here in this audience. We all support and we all go for an equal rights campaign to end this. Now, such a campaign does not talk about violence. It does not in any way espouse killing Israelis, expelling Israelis. It's talking about Palestinians and saying we need to have equal rights. But also it would have to be accompanied by a very smart PR campaign aiming at the peoples in the Western world, the peoples of the Western world. They will understand it and they will empathize with it. And that is the way to win them over. This is a way forward out of this horrible morass. And it also takes into account, which is how I started, that we have a real situation on the ground, which much as we would like to, we can't ignore. So when we have our ideals and we talk about the one democratic state that Jeff has talked about so well, that will be the end point. But the way to get there will be through a demand for equal rights, very much modeled on South Africa, very much modeled, although I know there are many differences between the two of them. What about if that doesn't happen? And that's the thought I want to leave you with. If that doesn't happen, efforts to support the Palestinians, as well as Palestinian efforts in themselves, will continue to be fragmented. And that's one of the weaknesses that we've had all along. My idea, which is the Equal Rights Campaign, would have the people on the ground leading it, and the diaspora and their friends supporting it. So you don't have 101 projects talking about different things. The diaspora's role is like the anti-apartheid role. You support the demand for equal rights inside. If you don't do that, you will continue to have a fragmentation of effort and suffering and bloodshed. And we don't want that. Okay.
If we could please start with 3 questions. I'll call, if you've got a question, put your hand up. And yes.
Yes, I think all 3 speakers agree on at least 2 things. One, the necessity of decolonizing the Zionist settler colonial state, and the necessity to undermine the Western support for that colonization process, which is accelerating all the time. You have different political concepts and ideas for what to call a political agenda, such as a one democratic state or equal rights and so on. But I want to ask 2 questions about those points where you agree. One, what are the different roles and responsibilities of people there and here because at least two of you spoke in great detail about the difficulties of trying to gain support for a decolonization project there. And it's important that we realize that, we understand that, but people here can't directly do anything about that. What we can do is, and are trying to do, we have been trying for decades, some of us, to undermine Western government support for the colonization project. So the second question then, about our role and responsibility, how can this perspective on decolonizing Israel-Palestine help us to be more effective in undermining that Western government support? And in particular, and let's be clear, I agree with everything you said about the so-called two-state solution, which really should be called a narrative, because it never was a solution. But it's a crucial narrative because it helps to justify that Western collusion. It's not the explanation for the collusion. It's pointless. Well, it's not pointless, but it might be futile simply to argue that it's a delusion and it never was a solution, because that doesn't explain the Western support. It's merely a pretext. So how do we undermine the pretext and the political drivers for Western support for the colonization project?
There seems to be a tension in, I guess, the narrative or logic of this one-state solution to me. And that's in that when you look at other settler colonial contexts in the present day, so-called Australia, so-called Canada, etc., they also work with this premise, like I think Chaim mentioned, that it's an indigenous peoples in a decolonizing movement who possess the final say, the veto power, the authorizing power for settlers' continuity in a decolonized future. I'm interested to know how you think that premise of, I guess, indigenous sovereignty being the primary or most important thing that's valued in a decolonizing process can then be reconciled with this, I guess, multifaceted or split or conglomerate kind of sovereignty that you're imagining. How can it be that indigenous people on one hand should have that final say, or that first say even, and on the other hand are expected to share that authority in a one-state solution?
I am a little surprised to have had no reference at all tonight to the Holocaust, because I've heard a huge number of generalizations. I will only look in detail at peace initiatives, and I spent a considerable amount of time at a school, which I'm sure you will know, called the Hand in Hand School in East Jerusalem. There are now several of these schools across Israel. And what is impressive is that they are set up precisely to bring together young Jews from the earliest age and young Muslims. They have an equal...
Quickly come to your
They have an equal... I am just wondering why it is that we are not supporting those kinds of initiatives, which are very successful, rather than talking in this very general way, which we may indeed ultimately need to do today, and to highlight the fact that there are really successful initiatives. So there are those two things. One, that I believe that we need to talk about shared suffering, and two, that we need to support these very practical enterprises.
Okay, that's 4 questions that have been thrown out.
I think one of the things we've been thinking about is this issue of strategy. There's no one-to-one correlation with South Africa, but South Africa provides some very useful lessons for us or possibilities. And in some ways in South Africa, you had the same situation. You had a white dominant ruling population that was never going to consider ending apartheid or giving equal rights to anybody else. And of course, a hostile government, the apartheid government, and an international community, by which I mean governments that were also hostile to the ANC and to the anti-apartheid people, Britain, as usual, in the lead. And so I think the ANC's strategy, and this was a strategy used by the FLN as well in Algeria, and that was to bypass all those obstacles, instead of saying, well, you know, they're so powerful, they're so strong, they have so many weapons, they're so supported by the international community, what can we do? And they took that as a challenge. And what they did is, as some of us of a certain age all know, was they went directly to the international grassroots, the ANC and the FLN. They went to churches that were very important. They went to university groups, they went to human rights groups, they went to community, you know, they mobilized the international grassroots. But they mobilized them, and that's what we're missing today. They mobilized them around a political program. In South Africa, the political program was, in modern terms, one person, one vote. That was the political program. So everybody knew why they were BDSing South Africa and what the political program was. And so, you know, we were able to mobilize. So that played, I think, certainly an important role in collapsing South Africa. I think that's what the Palestinians and their anti-colonial Israeli allies have to do as well. And we're never going to convince the Israeli population that, you know, they're even colonists, or that they should give equal rights to Palestinians, or that it should be two. We're never going to do that. I mean, why would they? The Settler Colonial Project is succeeding. They're ruling the country. They're benefiting. They have international. Why would they? So I think what we have to do is replicate what the ANC did to a degree, and that is create what I call a tripartite alliance. That is, the struggle has to be led by Palestinians. And that's a huge problem we don't have to get into tonight. You know, the fact that there is no more PLO has left a tremendous hole politically and also organizationally in this scattered Palestinian people. So the Palestinians struggle to organize themselves and to mobilize around a political program of their own and to define their own liberation is huge. But leaving that aside, then, a Palestinian-led struggle with a very clear political program. Because without the political program, you've got nothing to mobilize around. And anti-colonial Israelis like us come into the story. You know, the white members of the ANC played an important role in that struggle. But the main thing, and this is what I want to get to, is that then the Palestinians mobilize you guys. I mean, you're the only ally that the Palestinians have, really. And I think you're more powerful than you realize. And we showed that in the anti-apartheid movement and other times in history. And I think Israel's not as strong as the Palestinians think it is. I think they have more leverage than they know. Because Israel is strong among governments. But it's not strong, I think it's lost to a large degree in the court of public opinion. Not everybody is active, of course, on the Palestine issue, partly because there is no political program, so a lot of people might be sympathetic, but they don't know what to be active about. But I think the Palestinians can mobilize no less than the ANC did, the international public. And then your role in one direction is to change your government's policies. And that the FLN and ANC did manage to do, and also to effectively boycott economically and in other ways. It was a sports boycott, Israel, and make it just impossible for corporations to be associated with it. So I think that's the strategy that we have to follow. So that right now you just keep doing what you're doing because we're not there yet. But when there becomes a point where there is a consolidation around a political program that a critical mass of Palestinians accept, then I think the time will come when you'll be mobilized. And I think that's the way forward. And just really quick, in terms of your question, it's a real issue, liberation versus sharing the state, especially with the population. Many of you know, the students here, all know Mahmoud Mamdani, who's a very important scholar of settler colonialism. He himself was an Asian who was expelled from Uganda during Idi Amin's time. He went to Columbia University in the States, and he's back now in Uganda as the chancellor of Kampala University. And he has a very interesting new book, actually, called Neither Settler Nor Native, in which he talks about the Palestinians, South Africa, and the Native Americans. And he has a very interesting point, and that is that when he was a young man, and part of the anti-colonial movement fighting the colonists of Ghana for independence, and they won their political independence. He said they were euphoric. They thought that they were going to go back now to the pre-colonial time. The colonists are gone. It's our country again. We've taken it back again. They're even in a better position than the Palestinians. It wasn't the colonial population that remained behind. It's our country again. And then they discovered what he calls colonial legacies. Colonial legacies. The country is not the same country as it was before colonialism, even without the colonists. The economy is different. The geography is different. The urbanization is different. Everything's different in that country. And I think that's what the Palestinians are going to have. I think they understand that, but they haven't completely internalized it in terms of a political program. And that is, yes, we want our liberation, and like I said, have an intra-Palestinian discussion about what that means and so on. And but at the same time, and almost all Palestinians, except maybe those in some of the refugee camps that don't have any contact with the country, realize that they're not going to go back to 1948. That there is a colonial legacy here that is permanent even after colonialism ends, and that I think has to be just taken. That it's a bitter pill to swallow and so on. But that's a part of the equation, and I think it's up to the Palestinians actually they're going to have to go through that process of reconciliation. So it's there. It's a contradiction. It's true, but it's a legacy of the colonial period that is simply a reality.
Thank you, Jeff. Goddard, would you like to address the fourth? It was actually the fourth question, or any of the others.
I know.
This is your opportunity.
Look, just a few words about the first question, which was about decolonization and what's the role of people who are outside Palestine, supporters. What's the role in that? You see, one of the reasons that I'm putting forward this demand for equal rights, the campaign for equal rights, is that it will decolonize Israel. It just goes straight to the heart of the thing. Let's imagine that they get equal rights, the Palestinians get equal rights. What do you think the result will be? There's already more of them than there are Jewish Israelis. The result will be no Zionism, because Zionism can, by definition, requires a Jewish majority. That will put an end to that. And the whole paraphernalia around Zionism will also crumble once you get right into the heart of it. And in terms of supporters, it's a support for something very simple, very easy to understand, a demand for equal rights. And Jeff puts it as one person, one vote. Really, whatever is devised as the slogan, the Palestinians have to do it. There's no question about it. They have to do it. They have to start it. They have to put forward that program which demands equal rights. And then the role of people outside is to support the equal rights. Very quickly on the question of a Holocaust, why would there be a reference to the Holocaust? I don't understand. I'm not asking you to answer that question. Why would there be? It's a rhetorical question. Why would it? No, hang on. No, you said a lot. Why would I? We're talking about Palestinians, and we're talking about a movement of settler colonialism. The Holocaust is not something that involves the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not involved in the Holocaust. The Palestinians are not involved in any way, shape, or form with the
You are
Holocaust.
not in Israel. Let her speak.
They're not involved in it. And the fact that you've really touched a raw nerve, and the fact that the Palestinians have been made to pay for the Holocaust is disgusting.
I'll start from the end. Why not the Holocaust? Indeed, I actually understand what you're trying to do. I think we all do. And basically, my whole family was destroyed in the Holocaust. I've written about it, I've talked about it, I taught about it, I published about it. This is not the time to speak about the Holocaust. This is time to speak about the Nakba. This is time to talk about how we resolve what we as Jews have done after certain terrible things have been done to us. So the Holocaust should be mentioned because we've done something terrible to the Palestinians. Only in that connection. I'm sorry, you asked your question, you are not in Israel. Now, basically, Azmi Bishara, the famous Palestinian intellectual, said and wrote why Palestinians should understand the Holocaust. Palestinians, not people we're talking about here. Because in order to understand the Israeli mindset and the great madness which is inbuilt into Israeli politics, you need to understand that the Israelis are thinking in terms of the Holocaust about everything. Arafat was Hitler. You remember that some of us at my age at least remember Begin talking about Arafat in his bunker, like Hitler in his bunker. So basically the Israelis are not normal people in that sense because they've relate to a very traumatic time in Europe. But the Palestinians have nothing to do with that. And every time we talk about the Nakba, somebody pulls out the winning card of the Holocaust. And what about the Holocaust? What about anti-Semitism? What are these things to do with Palestine? The Palestinians started anti-Semitism? Thank you.
Who came and
Stop! Now, you are unable to listen. We have listened to you. You are unable to listen to us when we answer your question.
everything you said.
You're not
So,
in Israel.
shut up.
You can't get away with it here.
Now, the question you asked there, the lady on the left, I think is the key question for me tonight. We are not talking immediately. We're talking about a process. Rada has explained it beautifully. Nothing will happen overnight. It can't. The depth of deprivation of the Israeli regime is such that enormous damage has been caused to millions of people living under its control and continue to live under its control. They are traumatized, and Israel is not just killing Palestinians, bombing them, removing them from their livelihood and their land, but they are traumatizing them by design. Now, I don't want here to start making, comparisons to the Holocaust or to any other area on Earth or any other period on Earth. It is enough to say that the trauma that the Palestinians have suffered is such that it's very difficult to find what to compare it with over the last 70 years. After all, this is a very long trauma. Now, your question relates to the fact that we can't have a system which is symmetrical. And I think the three of us talked about that. There is no point pretending that after a certain date, everything will be fine because we are all living together in peace. There will be enormous problems. Look, there are almost a million children or more than a million children in Gaza. You talked about those schools that take Israeli and Palestinian students. I supported those schools. I worked in them. You wrote about them. I worked in them. We three have worked in Palestine in different organizations, so we don't need to be lectured to about what needs to be done. Thank you very much. these schools are necessary, but will not resolve the problem. The problem can only be resolved by a very strong state. Now, I am normally not a supporter of strong states. But imagine if the state is not strong enough to turn the clock back on racism, to turn the clock back on apartheid, to not allow, to actually limit the freedom to speak any hate speech, to limit the freedom. I'm saying this. And this is the case in South Africa, and it would have to be the case in Palestine. So we're not talking about on the one hand, on the other hand. What do you think? We want to talk about a Holocaust. Let's invite a survivor and a Nazi, and everyone will explain their point of view. This is nonsensical. We're not going to do that.
We've heard this evening about atrocities that have gone on for far too long. We can hardly bear to hear the news anymore about the demolition of homes, the people dying, the closures. All of this is going on. We want to move on to a just and sustainable solution. This evening, you've heard about ideas that have been developed now, going back to the start of what the PLO proposed, and with the reviving now of looking at what would be involved in creating one democratic state. We've heard about how this is being unpacked. Questions are being asked, really examined. This is what's going on. There's so much to address. I also started by saying we're not going to be able to cover it all tonight by any means, but things have been thrown out. We ask that you go to the resource table outside, see material from the Jewish Network for Palestine, from ICAD UK. We do have a brochure that addresses resisting apartheid, building a shared democracy. We encourage you to engage with governments, engage in solidarity. Let's keep doing what we can, because if we want to change history, it does depend on us. It depends on you and me really taking an active role now. So I would like to thank you for coming. I want to thank our speakers for everything that they put out, for the years that they have spent working, researching, writing to, again, lead us forward in new ways to live. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.